Dirty Jobs, heavy-duty bathroom, foaming cleaner, dirty jobs, heavy-duty bathroom with bleach. Yeah, but why that photo?
You tell me, what's the dirt story behind that photo?
The story begins just after sunrise, when the first quiet reports drifted out of a suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever happens. A few residents noticed unmarked vans parked on the street, men in plain clothing stepping out with equipment cases, and a kind of subdued urgency that made them linger behind windows. They didn't know whose house the team was approaching until someone recognized the distinctive collection of classic cars in the driveway. That was when the rumor started. Something was going on inside Mike Rowe's home, and nobody knew what. Inside the house, responders moved without sirens or alarms. There had been no reported injury, no accident, no fire. The call had been specific and strangely coded, coming from inside the home, but not from Mike Rowe himself. The crew walked down the hall toward a single locked bathroom door, while the air carried a faint smell that none of them recognized immediately. It wasn't rot or chemicals or mold, just a strange, earthy odor that didn't belong in a bathroom at all. Mike Rowe wasn't present when the team arrived. According to the person who answered the door, he had left early that morning on a routine filming schedule. Everything seemed normal in the rest of the home. Tidy, quiet, lived in the way you'd expect from a man who traveled constantly. But the bathroom door was sealed shut, as if it hadn't been opened in weeks, the frame reinforced in a way none of them could explain. A technician laid a hand on it and felt a subtle vibration, like a distant machine humming behind the wall. They pried the door open carefully, expecting perhaps a plumbing issue or an electrical smell. Instead, they froze at the threshold, confronted with the sight of a bathroom that barely resembled one. The sink and toilet were intact, but the walls were lined with makeshift shelving, containers, instruments, and a surprising number of sealed bags. A thick tube snaked out from under the sink, leading to a small compressor that wasn't connected to the house's system. Everything was meticulously arranged, almost like a private lab hidden inside the most ordinary room imaginable. Dust motes drifted in the light as they stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of metal, damp earth, and something organic. A tarp covered the bathtub, and beneath it were shapes that no one could immediately identify. One technician lifted a corner of the tarp and recoiled, not in horror, but in disbelief. Beneath it lay a collection of soil samples, tightly packed in glass jars, each meticulously labeled with dates and coordinates that spanned 2 decades and dozens of U.S. states. The labels read like a map of Mike Rowe's career, locations that Dirty Jobs fans remembered: coal mines, sewage tunnels, slaughterhouses, fishing docks, factories, soil marked from the floors of the dirtiest, most unforgiving workplaces in America. Some jars held sediment so dark it seemed unnatural, others filled with strange fibers, and one jar contained a faintly glowing residue that looked almost alive. The team spread out, documenting everything, unsure if they were standing inside a contamination hazard or a personal archive. It was clear that this wasn't a recent project. The layers of dust on some containers suggested they hadn't been touched in years, yet other items looked new. A freshly sealed container sat on the counter next to a pair of gloves, a magnifying lens, and a notebook left open to a page where Mike had scrawled a few cryptic lines that hinted at something weighing heavily on him. Behind the bathroom mirror, which had been partially detached from the wall, they found a deeper cavity. Inside were dozens of vials filled with substances that defied immediate explanation. Some were thick and tar-like, others crystalline. Several were tagged with the names of industries: rendering plants, tanneries, chemical treatment facilities. These weren't stolen samples. They appeared to be remnants from jobs he had personally documented, saved for reasons that were not yet clear. A technician opened a metal case tucked behind the toilet. Inside were memory cards. Some dated all the way back to the earliest seasons of Dirty Jobs. Many had never been seen by producers, labeled as unusable, too disturbing, or not for broadcast. It was the first clue that what they found here wasn't only physical material. It was history that had been locked away because someone believed it couldn't be aired. The most unsettling discovery was a small sealed container sitting on the closed lid of the toilet, placed almost ceremonially. It was filled with a pale, fibrous material that looked like a cross between plant matter and hair. The label mentioned a paper mill, a night shift, and the phrase, unaccounted exposure. It raised questions that none of them wanted to ask out loud. The deeper they searched, the more they realized the bathroom had been converted into a kind of controlled environment. The ventilation was modified, the tiles sealed with silicone, and a secondary lining had been installed behind the walls. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure whatever was kept in here didn't escape into the rest of the house. One of the responders discovered a hidden drawer beneath the sink cabinet. Inside it was a flash drive sealed inside a waterproof pouch. When they plugged it into an isolated device, they found a single video file. The thumbnail showed Mike Rowe sitting on the edge of the same bathtub, the tarp behind him still folded, his expression exhausted, yet determined. He recorded the message late at night, judging by the darkness through the small bathroom window. In the video, Mike spoke candidly. He explained that after years of traveling to the dirtiest workplaces in America, he had started collecting samples, not for a show, not for publicity, but because he believed that some of what he'd seen would never be understood if it wasn't preserved. He described encountering substances that even industrial safety teams hadn't properly classified, materials that workers handled daily without protection. He said he felt a responsibility to keep track of the truth, even if he couldn't broadcast it. His voice was steady, but tired. He admitted he had begun storing the samples in the bathroom because it was the only room he could effectively isolate without drawing attention. He didn't want to alarm the crew or the network. He didn't want to create panic. But he said he needed a place where he could confront what the show never showed, the unseen danger that millions of workers lived with every day. In another clip, recorded weeks later, Mike mentioned that some samples had begun reacting with each other, not violently, but in ways he hadn't expected. Strange discolorations, unusual growths, patterns forming in the glass. He wasn't a scientist, but he knew enough to be uneasy. That was when he installed the new ventilation and reinforced the door. The team paused the video when Mike leaned in close to the camera and said something that chilled them. "What I've seen out there doesn't always stay out there. Sometimes it comes home with you." He didn't elaborate, but the weight of the remark lingered in the room like a shadow. Investigators found more evidence of that statement in a lower cabinet where a respirator mask was tucked beneath old towels. The filter cartridges were discolored and corroded. Whatever he had been working with, it had been potent enough to require protection. The bathtub revealed even more startling objects when they lifted the tarp fully. Large metal canisters sat beneath the soil jars, some marked with industrial codes that hinted at toxic waste or biohazard exposure. Yet they weren't dangerous in their current state. They were sealed, preserved, artifacts of jobs that most Americans never wanted to think about. Someone found another notebook wedged behind the bath pipes. Inside were detailed accounts Mike had written about workers who had fallen ill over the years, jobs where he had witnessed safety corners being cut, factories where he had filmed but felt unable to show the full truth. Some pages were streaked with moisture, as though he had written through sweat or tears. Another video on the flash drive featured Mike speaking more openly about his emotional burden. He confessed that he sometimes woke up thinking about the grime, the filth, the hazards he had walked through. Not because he feared for himself, but because he had seen firsthand what millions of workers dealt with daily. He said he felt haunted by the thought that people only saw the humor and grit of dirty jobs, not the hidden cost. The responders began sealing the materials in secure containers to transport them for safety evaluation. At this point, word had leaked to the outside through a contractor who recognized Mike Rowe's name on some documents. A small crowd was beginning to form on the street. Neighbors, local reporters, curious onlookers trying to peek past the privacy barricades. Inside, the team continued cataloging. They found a cloth bundle tucked behind the water heater, tied with a leather cord. Inside were fragments of uniforms from various job sites. Coveralls, gloves, boots, each carrying stains and residues that told their own quiet stories. These weren't trophies. They were reminders. The most mysterious object was discovered last, wedged behind a panel in the wall. It was a small, sealed acrylic block containing something that looked like a hardened mass of fused fibers, metal shavings, and organic tissue. The label was the longest one yet, describing a night in an industrial recycling plant where machinery had malfunctioned. Mike had written that the substance represented everything we pretend doesn't mix together in the modern world. A forensic scientist examining it whispered that it shouldn't scientifically exist in that form. It was as if multiple materials with incompatible properties had merged under pressure and heat in a way that defied normal industrial conditions. The object became the centerpiece of the investigation. Outside, the growing buzz turned into a media storm. News vans arrived. Rumors spread wildly. Some suggested a hazardous incident. Others claimed Mike had been conducting illegal experiments. The truth was far more human and far more profound. Late that evening, Mike Rowe returned home. Calmly, he walked past the reporters and approached the officials waiting inside. When they asked him to explain the bathroom, he nodded, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he told them the truth. He explained that the bathroom wasn't a laboratory. It was a memorial, a place where he kept the physical reminders of everything he had learned about the people who kept the country running. He stored the samples not for science, but for accountability. He wanted a record of the world as it truly was beneath the surface. He said he intended someday to create a documentary that showed what dirty jobs never could. He answered every question patiently. He acknowledged the potential safety concerns. He agreed to hand over the materials for proper analysis, but he insisted that none of it should be misunderstood. He said the bathroom was a place where he processed the weight of gratitude and responsibility he felt after each job. Investigators later confirmed that while some materials required careful handling, none posed a public danger. The bathroom was sealed out of precaution, not crisis. The most surprising revelation came from the analysis of the objects. Many contained industrial contaminants at levels far higher than regulations allowed. Mike had unintentionally amassed evidence of widespread safety violations across multiple industries. Producers from the show were shocked. Cameramen admitted they had suspected Mike kept a private record, but never imagined its scale. Workers from years past reached out with appreciation, saying they felt seen in a way they hadn't before. The small acrylic block caused the greatest stir among scientists. After weeks of study, they determined that the fused mass was created during a catastrophic equipment failure at a recycling facility. The materials represented the compressed detritus of multiple industries: fabric, metal, plastic, organic waste, forced together under a pressure that nearly exceeded mechanical limits. The event had injured workers, though the details had been buried under corporate reports. Mike had saved the fragment as a reminder of what nearly went unseen. When he finally addressed the public, Mike didn't dramatize anything. He spoke humbly about the importance of acknowledging the true conditions workers face. He said the bathroom had been his private space for reflection and responsibility. He admitted he should have consulted experts sooner, but he never intended harm. His final words echoed something he had said in the video found earlier, that real labor is messy, real work is dangerous, and the country runs on people who rarely get the recognition they deserve. The bathroom, strange as it was, had been his attempt to keep those truths alive. In the end, the shocking discovery inside Mike Rowe's bathroom wasn't a hazard, a scandal, or a mystery experiment. It was a hidden archive of America's unseen labor. The dirt, the danger, the grit, the human cost. It was a silent testimony from a man who had spent years walking through the hardest jobs in the country and couldn't bear the thought of forgetting what he had witnessed. And when the investigators finally closed the door, sealing the last container and carrying it away, the house felt strangely quiet, as if a burden had finally lifted. But the truth remained. Behind one ordinary bathroom door had been a world the rest of us rarely see, preserved by someone who believed it needed to be remembered. The story faded from headlines in the weeks that followed, but the revelations lingered in the minds of those who heard them. What they found in Mike Rowe's bathroom was shocking, not because it was dangerous, but because it was true, an unfiltered, unvarnished record of the world beneath the world, hidden in plain sight. And as Mike returned to his work, he carried with him the knowledge that the secrets he once kept behind a locked door were now part of a much larger conversation. A conversation about labor, dignity, danger, and the invisible foundation on which the country stands. A conversation he had always hoped would one day begin, even if he never expected it to start with the opening of a bathroom door. The fused mass was created during a catastrophic equipment failure at a recycling plant, a moment when metal, plastic fibers, and organic residue were all compressed, overheated, and torn apart in a single violent motion. What made it extraordinary wasn't its origin, but that it encapsulated in physical form the chaotic reality Mike Rowe had always talked about. That dirty jobs weren't just messy, they were unpredictable, dangerous, and deeply human. The block became symbolic, something investigators found themselves staring at longer than they expected, as if it represented the collision of labor and oversight, of workers and the systems meant to protect them. As the investigation wrapped, the bathroom was finally cleared out, the shelves emptied, the vials sealed, and the soil samples packed into secure crates. The room felt hollow, almost mournful, like a small museum gutted overnight. Yet even stripped bare, it carried an emotional weight that made the officials hesitate before closing the door. They all felt, in their own way, that they had stepped into a secret chapter of American labor history, one preserved by a man who simply refused to let people forget what he had seen. Mike walked back into the bathroom later that night, alone for the first time since the discovery. The empty shelves echoed his footsteps. He stood in the center of the room where he had spent countless late hours cataloging things no one else wanted to think about. He touched the spot where his camera had once been mounted, the place above the sink where he had leaned so many times, speaking into the lens about truths he wasn't ready to reveal. Without the artifacts, the room seemed smaller. But it wasn't empty. It still carried the sense of purpose he had given it. The emotional weight of it all seemed to settle on him at once. He wasn't a scientist or investigator. He was a storyteller. And for years, he had stored these pieces of the world because he believed they mattered, even when no one else thought so. Now the world finally understood why. The bathroom had been an archive of the invisible struggles of American workers, a quiet rebellion against the sanitized version of labor that too many people accepted. Outside, reporters clamored for comment, but Mike stayed inside until he was ready. When he finally stepped out to speak, the crowd silenced almost instantly. He didn't give a speech. Instead, he spoke plainly, explaining that everything discovered in the bathroom had been collected out of respect for the workers, for the jobs, for the stories that couldn't be told on television. He explained that those samples represented the realities people lived every day, realities often overshadowed by humor, grit, and entertainment. He admitted that maybe he should have stored the materials differently. Maybe he should have consulted experts earlier. But he said he had never once believed he was doing something dangerous. He believed he was honoring the workers whose lives he had stepped into. He said the bathroom was his way of keeping their stories close when the cameras stopped rolling. When he finished, the reporters didn't shout questions immediately. For a moment, the crowd simply absorbed the weight of what he had said. The story that had been sensationalized as a bizarre and possibly scandalous discovery transformed into something deeper, an intimate look at the burden carried by someone who had witnessed the hardest, dirtiest, and most forgotten jobs in America. The crates were taken to a secure facility for proper analysis. Scientists, safety experts, and industrial hygienists began evaluating the materials not as curiosities, but as historical evidence. Mike agreed to participate in the process, providing context for each sample. Some of the findings were already surprising. Certain residues from factories had been banned years earlier, yet the samples proved they were still present long after they should have disappeared. Other samples revealed microbial colonies resilient enough to survive conditions previously thought impossible. The memory cards contained footage that was raw, unfiltered, and sometimes hard to watch. Not because it was gruesome, but because it showed the quiet dignity and exhaustion of workers in moments that never made it to broadcast. The footage displayed moments of vulnerability, laughter that masked fear, and camaraderie forged in difficult spaces. Some clips featured workers confiding in Mike about injuries, long hours, or worries they never wanted their bosses to hear. He had turned the camera off when needed, but he kept the memories, now stored on tiny cards hidden behind a bathroom wall. Producers reached out to him, asking if this footage was something he wanted to release. Mike said he didn't know yet. It wasn't entertainment, it was testimony, and testimony needed to be treated with care. He wasn't sure if the world was ready for an unfiltered look at the cost of the jobs it relied on every day. Over the next few days, interviews with workers from past episodes surfaced online. Many had warm words for Mike. They talked about how he showed up without ego, stepped into their world with genuine curiosity, and never made fun of them. Some said they weren't surprised he had saved those samples. They remembered how thoughtful he seemed after cameras stopped rolling, how he lingered to ask them questions about safety, regulations, and the things that kept them awake at night. As the public conversation grew, the bathroom became a symbol of something larger. Commentators debated whether the country had overlooked the reality of its workforce. Safety advocates praised Mike for collecting materials that might help expose long-ignored hazards. Workers called into radio shows saying they felt represented for the first time in years. Social media split between shock and admiration. Some joked about the absurdity of a bathroom-turned-laboratory. Others recognized it as a deeply human response to witnessing hardship. In private, Mike reflected on what came next. He knew he couldn't rebuild the bathroom the same way. He no longer needed a secret room to hold the weight of what he'd seen. The discovery had forced the truth into the open, and perhaps that was how it was meant to be. He thought about the workers he'd met, about their stories, about the artifacts that had now moved into the hands of experts who could analyze them, protect them, and learn from them. For the first time, he felt relief knowing he wasn't carrying it alone. A few weeks later, the analysis of the acrylic block came back. The fused mass wasn't dangerous, but it was unprecedented. It showed structural patterns that revealed how machinery could fail under extreme conditions, a discovery that could help prevent future accidents. Industrial engineers reached out, asking permission to study it further. Mike agreed without hesitation. If it could prevent even one worker from being injured, then the bathroom had served its purpose. As more results came in, patterns emerged. Several soil samples contained residues from chemicals no longer legally allowed in certain industries, suggesting that illegal disposal practices had continued long after regulations changed. Others revealed microbial growths that offered new insights into biohazards faced by sanitation workers. These findings began influencing discussions in industrial safety boards and labor councils. What had started as a shocking discovery in a bathroom was now shaping conversations that mattered. The footage found on the memory cards underwent similar examination. Experts from documentary ethics boards acknowledged that while some scenes were too personal to release, others had immense educational value. Conversations began about creating a new project, one led not by entertainment, but by honesty. Mike was hesitant at first, but gradually the idea grew on him. Not a show, not a series, but a testament. The bathroom items were eventually placed into climate-controlled archives. Some were destined for museums dedicated to American labor history. Others would be used in university studies. Mike visited the archive facility once. He walked among the shelves where each jar, vial, and fragment now sat in labeled, polished cases. It looked nothing like the cluttered bathroom, but the gravity was the same. These were pieces of a country people rarely saw. Mike stood before one of the shelves, running his hand along the label of a jar containing sediment from a coal mine. He remembered the worker who had helped him collect it, a man who had lost 2 fingers in a conveyor accident, but still showed up to work because he had a family to feed. The jar seemed heavier than its weight suggested. As he left the archive, he realized something unexpected. The bathroom had been a burden because he bore it alone. But now the burden was shared, studied, understood. What had once been secret was now contributing to something bigger than himself. In the following months, the story faded from scandal to significance. People no longer whispered about Mike Rowe's bathroom lab. Instead, they spoke about workplace safety, industrial transparency, and the hidden realities of labor. Mike continued his work, still telling stories, still giving workers the dignity they deserved. But something had changed in him. He felt lighter, more grounded, more honest with himself about the impact those years had on him. And even though the bathroom was sanitized and restored, looking ordinary once again, it would forever hold its own quiet place in the story of America's workforce. It had become an unexpected birthplace of truth, a reminder that sometimes the dirtiest jobs leave stains not just on clothing, but on the conscience of those who witness them. In the end, what they found in Mike Rowe's bathroom was shocking, not because it was dangerous or illegal, but because it was deeply human. It was the private archive of a man who had spent years walking into the hardest corners of society, carrying home the pieces that others wanted to forget. It was the evidence of a truth rarely spoken, that the people who keep the world running often do so at great cost, and someone must remember them. And someone did. Mike Rowe's bathroom had been a sanctuary of stories, a chamber of honesty, a place where dirt wasn't filth. It was testimony. And now, finally, that testimony belonged not to four walls, but to the world that needed to hear it.